We're going to pick up here with the problems of the Articles of Confederation answers for the part 2. So here we start with the first question is, what two parts of government did not exist at the time of the Articles of Confederation? I gave you these two visuals. So hopefully you wrote down a national court system and an executive branch. So there was no courts and no president. So today we have a 3-branch government, and back then they had a 1-branch, which was kind of problematic because they could make laws, but they had no court system to interpret them, and they also had no executive branch to enforce them. The next part is asking you about how the actual government worked. So at the time there was a national Congress, and each state had exactly, hopefully you put, 1 vote. 1 vote sounds fair. Everybody is the same. That's what they sort of pushed. But the problem was not everyone was the same. There was obviously larger populated states and smaller populated states. But what they came up with during the days in which they created the Articles of Confederation during the time period of the American Revolution, they wanted each state to have exactly 1 vote. Moving on, they then said, okay, well, if every state has 1 vote, we've got 13 votes, how many does it take to make a law? And some people thought, well, maybe 7, that's a simple majority. But no, again, they wanted to make it a little bit more difficult, and so they came up with 9 votes, sort of a super majority, which was somewhat frustrating because it was hard to get those 9 states all to agree. Finally, if you fix the articles and realize that, hey, there's a part of the articles that needs to be changed, you needed all 13. All 13 were needed to make any change. Since you needed 13, you can probably guess how many times they actually changed the articles, and that would be absolutely none. They never were able to change the articles. Usually the one that was the stick in the mud was actually Rhode Island. For some reason, Rhode Island, I don't know what their issue was, but they just always put their foot down, and they were the ones stopping any kind of change. So let's talk about new land policies, because that's the one thing that the government had to deal with and actually did an okay job with, was all that extra land that we as the Americans received at the end of the American Revolution. So the first one is called the Ordinance of 1785. The reason why I have this kind of highlighted is that you have to understand some new words. Ordinance is just a big word for law. And so what this law did is it created a policy, a plan for surveying and dividing up land in the West. So when you guys do definitions and stuff, please make sure that you're putting your own kind of words and verbiage in that makes sense best to you. So most 13-year-olds don't talk about policies and surveying. They can make sense of plans and dividing it up. And also involved in that is that they took all this extra land and they had to create it into territories. And then those territories were created into townships and then subdivided into sections. So basically the whole thing was the government was there to create a plan for others to follow. And following that plan, they realized that there was one section that needed a special order, and it was the Northwest Ordinance, Northwest Law. And the reason why it's called the Northwest Ordinance, no fans of Kanye here, is that it was north and west of the Ohio River. So the very first thing it did is it created a territory that they simply called the Northwest Territory. And in that, they created, again, a plan, how and then when those territories would go from territories to states. But they also took it a step further, and they gave the people inside those residents a special Bill of Rights, things like freedom of religion and trial by jury. And they also did something that was very progressive, and the men at the time pushed for and got a ban on slavery in any of those territories that are north and west of the Ohio River. Would never allow slaves in those areas. So from the very start, all the areas of the Northwest Territory, and you'll see a map here soon, would never allow slavery within its borders. So take a look here at this map. So there is the Ohio River, okay? And everything that is north and west of it is the Northwest Territory. So in it, they said in the law that there should be no fewer than 3 states. So we could have had a jumbo kind of state right here. Instead of it being divided between Wisconsin and Illinois, Same thing with Michigan and Indiana, but they did subdivide it into 5 different states. Now, part of it becomes the state and the territory of Minnesota. Now, the number that they were looking for was 60,000. So when 60,000 people got into the territory of Ohio, it would become a state, and they draw a line where their claim would end. Continuing on, it asks the question that what problems did America have on 2 fronts? Well, the first front was economics, or money. And the biggest problem we had, of course, was huge debt. The Americans borrowed millions and millions of dollars back then. Today it would be billions of dollars. Some estimate as high as $33 billion in today's money. They had that much of a debt outstanding. So what they wanted to do is figure out how could they pay those debts. But the problem was they couldn't really pay those debts because they had some initial problems in the setup of their government and how they would go about a process of doing that. Added to it, as we talked about, the money in the United States was all messed up. The continental dollars that were actually put out by the national government depreciated in value. What that means is it loses value. And then there was other money floating around. So it was all kinds of confusion going on. So let's ask this question, what can governments do when they have a debt? Well, they got to create a tax to raise revenue. The problem is, and we're going into the last questions, what guy had a plan to fix it? Now, some people just went with the, Washington or Hamilton. No. It's a guy you never heard of before, but if you were around at the time, you recognize the name Robert Morris. He was considered like the financier of the American Revolution. And he came up with a plan to have a 5% import tax, what we call a tariff today. The problem was it adopted? Well, to do this, you would have to change the Articles of Confederation's basics, which meant they could tax the citizens. And that would require how many votes? It would require 13 votes. So, guess what? It wasn't adopted. They got 12 of the 13, and yes, the one who was the fly in the ointment, the stick in the mud, was Rhode Island. So, last 2. I gave you flags. Hopefully you recognize the Union Jack. So our problem with Great Britain is this. Great Britain still had troops in the area where the Great Lakes are. So up in here, the British still allowed those areas to be controlled by some of their forts. They never really let the men leave there, so that was an issue. Also, the other thing was trade was going on, so it's more economics here, but they were pushing us out of trade in the Caribbean, and the biggest thing was that those areas were rich in trade goods. A lot of times fruits, vegetables, those type of things, sugar. And what they did was Great Britain basically bullied us out and said to the merchants that would sell, if you sell to the Americans, you will lose our business. And so in effect, it basically blocked us down there. And the man that was sent was this guy, John Adams. You recognize his name, hopefully, and start to recognize his picture. He is sent as our delegate over to Great Britain to work this out. The last thing is we have problems with Spain. So this is the Spanish flag here. And they were prohibiting the United States from using the Mississippi River all the way down to the bottom, down here to New Orleans. Remember, basically, the line would cut right through about here, and that everything south of it was claimed by Spain. Southern Mississippi, Alabama, all of Florida, this whole area over here. And so what we did is we sent John Jay over to negotiate a treaty to work that out. You might recognize his name, maybe his picture. You remember he was this guy here in the Treaty of Paris. So he was a very experienced diplomat. So that's how we end here in 7.1 in the various questions.